So welcome, my name's Louise and welcome to our first PM Forum Scotland session since the lockdown. So I hope everyone's managing to keep sane. We're joined today by Robin Dix. Robin has over 30 years experience in market and client insight programmes and is going to talk to us today about how we get the best results from our feedback programmes. In addition to what we did say we were going to talk about, Robin's also going to look at the impact COVID-19 may have on our current feedback programmes and on any feedback programmes going forward. So I'll just hand over to Robin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise, and thanks for that introduction. Yeah, as mentioned, really, when we were starting to take a look at this, we were thinking about, and the focus of that was very much about how to increase the participation of clients in feedback programs and the ways to motivate those and some of the things to do around that. But basically, what we've done is we're going to update this and really to talk about it in a slightly broader context, and really in terms of making the most of client feedback programs and how to think about client feedback, how to think about client dialogue, not only in the kind of just the immediate future and the kind of sort of height of COVID-19, but as things begin to progressively change, what things might stay the same, what things might change, what things might evolve, what this will mean for your clients, and how to adapt your processes and dialogue and the way you ask questions to deal with that. So I'm just going to share the screen in terms of some slides now, and we'll go through that. And I think as you should know, what I think as mentioned, what we'll do is we'll take questions, obviously, I think at the end, but do use the kind of Q&A button. And what we'll do is we'll make sure we wrap those up, and Louise will wrap those, make sure we answer any of those kind of key questions at the end. Okay. So, as I said, really, how are we going to get the best results from client feedback programs, given the changing situation, and very importantly, what does this mean in terms of driving success for the firm? How are you really going to ensure that you get results, given perhaps impacts on budget, given perhaps impact on the time you spend on various things? Is this still relevant? If it is, what are the ways to think about evolving and changing? And indeed, if you haven't got a program in place, what might you think about in terms of making sure it gets the best results possible? So we will go through some of these things, and hopefully as many as we can. As I mentioned previously, one of the things which is pretty important, and this doesn't change particularly in terms of the importance of the objective, is making sure this is a kind of engaging exercise for your clients, that they see there is a benefit in taking part, that it actually helps in terms of gaining that additional engagement with them, and therefore we are making the exercise work for really all the stakeholders. Of course, that means you in the kind of marketing or BD community, but it means your colleagues, and it means your clients, and it means your other stakeholders as well. So we will look at some do's and don'ts, things to take into account. Some things that actually kind of cause people that you want to provide feedback or can cause them to disengage and not see it as relevant, or not see it as sufficiently valuable to spend X minutes or whatever the amount of time is on it. And because it's important in terms of not just the kind of content of your feedback programs, but the means that your firm, or essentially the ability of your firm to gain the financial and other benefits from it, we will take a look at the end in terms of, well, how do you gain more buy-in? A few notes on how do you gain buy-in from colleagues, because I mean, my guess would be, and there may be people who are logging on from firms where they have a range of colleagues who are all absolutely bought in and who don't argue with anything and don't challenge anything and are absolute advocates of the thing. But my guess is most of you will be experiencing, you have a range of people running through, from people who, for want of a better word, instinctively get it, to those who perhaps don't so much. So we'll cover that too. So what might be different from now on? And I think what we're seeing over the course of the last few weeks, from the early March, and when that shock, if you like, hit, we are seeing a gradual evolution in how people are behaving and how people are acting. And the most obvious thing, of course, at the beginning was that rush, completely understandably and completely sensibly, to move from a sort of in-office, face-to-face environment for many people to using technology. So that, of course, and it's pretty self-evident, isn't it, that means of contact has changed. And I think what we saw at the same time was kind of a very much a sort of move for firms to be quite, again, very understandably, keen to push out as much information as they could about how they were reacting to COVID-19, what they were put in place, and a big push of information. And I think what we're beginning to see now is a bit about, the mechanisms of contact and technology being a bit normalized, if you like, but a little bit of a stepping back. And we were talking to an accountancy firm just earlier, in fact, at the back end of last week, talking about that kind of stepping back and recognizing a need not just to push information now, but to hear and to get dialogue and to get feedback and make sure that we're listening as well. So, and I'm talking about these things both in the context of how we might think about gaining feedback from clients, but equally, and in many ways, perhaps even more importantly, thinking about what this is going to mean for the ways that your clients will work and what they want from a relationship, even post the kind of immediate process we're going through now. Because what we're really beginning to try and uncover and understand is which of these things are sort of temporary changes and blips, and which will have longer term aspects and implications. Okay, so life changes, again, I think, put there. If you think about many of those people within your client base, if you've got, let's say, a number of SMEs and your contact is with owners of businesses, this could be a pretty profound moment for many of them. They may well be rethinking what their medium-term future looks like. They may be rethinking their aspirations and aims as a business. They may be rethinking all sorts of things. So it's quite important not to just assume, and I don't think many of us would, but not to just assume that the kind of things that were driving their aspirations, their use of professional advice, their choice of professional advisors will stay the same as it did yesterday. And we're beginning, it's early days, but we're beginning to see some sort of evolution of that. And to be honest, I can't tell you exactly what that means at the moment, but my belief would be that what we might see shortly is, as I said, a change in what's required from advisors. And I think it might sound a silly thing to say, but I think the whole piece which we've talked about for a long time about operating as a trusted advisor has become fundamentally more important in the last few weeks. Of course, it's never been unimportant, but people kind of need a friend at the moment. There are owners of businesses who, really, because of the levels of uncertainty provided, because of their hope and aim to access support or advice or those things, those aspects of a professional services provider, which are really about that being a trusted advisor, friend, confidant, place of not only technical advice, but emotional kind of support and helping someone see routes out of this, are potentially massively important at the moment. And this is a really flippant comment to make, and I apologize in a sense for it, but I think some of the things that are important to us all are changing. I don't think many people are too worried about whether they've got the most up-to-date trainers at the minute. If you take kind of the sort of very old theory, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs, some of those other things that, much more fundamental to us, our sense of well-being and safety and all those things, they are now much more important than, do I want to blow X pounds on the latest thing? And so it really is changing what's important to all of us. And for you, there's a significant impact in terms of to what degree are you able to understand how it is changing the decision making of those people that you want to continue working for and potentially. So those are some of the things that I think are evolving. Some of the things that I think are still profoundly the same are the need to, as it says here, ensure that you understand what drives the choice between you and other advisors, and indeed your market needs. So in many ways, I think we can all probably expect that life is going to be a bit harder in the foreseeable future. The competitive environment will be difficult. There may well be some form of competitive sort of shakeout. And therefore, it's really important to understand where there are changes in what clients want from an advisor, that you're able to retain as much of that business as you possibly can, and that and in many ways, you're able to understand, of course, which clients are at risk, either because of their requirements are changing, or because, as I mentioned, there will be people who, for a number of reasons, will not necessarily either continue to trade or have the same requirements for a professional advisor at the end of the period. So identifying those, really, really important. I think it's fair to say, and I'll mention the upside, and I know it can be quite difficult to see some of the upsides at the moment, but I'll mention some of the upsides that I think will begin to flow through over the course of time shortly as well. I think what I recognise, and I think is true for many of you, will be there has been an increase in the attempts to have a dialogue and communicate with clients from those, in a very traditional term, fee owners, who are now spending less time in internal meetings and more time at home, and hopefully are therefore engaging more in conversations and dialogue with clients. And that's great. That's really good news. I think what is the case is there's definitely a better appetite for people to do that amongst them. It's still the case that not everybody is necessarily equipped to have those open conversations about what really is important to client, what's going to drive their needs and what they're looking at doing, and how they decide between professional advisors. So while that's really good news, I don't think we can assume that is going to give us all the insight that we need within firms. And so, that what we're talking about in terms of feedback programs doesn't replace that. It's just the thing that makes sure you gain and you collate all that information that you really need, both to make decisions that work for the firm as a whole, and then the right strategic decisions to make, and indeed enable you to serve each of those clients effectively as well. I don't have time to go through this in a huge amount of detail, and certainly it's one of those things that if anybody did want to understand a bit more, I'd be very happy to talk further about or share more information about. But it is, again, worth in these times taking a step back and saying, what are we really trying to do through marketing, business development, communication with clients as a firm? And what we tend to talk about is if our efforts aren't having an impact on one of these things that is increasing our level of revenue and putting us in a stronger financial or strategic position, kind of why are we doing them? And if we were talking a few months ago, I'd probably be stressing much more the issue around the improving the ability to extend relationships and how firms do that, and the significance of knowing what's valued by clients, where there's opportunities for additional work. Of course, talking about the improved ability to gain new clients. I think for the immediate future, we're also going to be talking a lot more about the increased ability to retain client relationships and help them, providing them with sufficient value to help them survive and continue. So these things are still important, but I think they're beginning to evolve. And I guess to that point, let's move on and talk about perhaps what some of the issues are that might be relevant for us to ask now. Let me perhaps take the second one there, because I think it's obvious, isn't it, that the scenario we're faced with, and circumstances and characteristics of all our markets are different than they were, in January or in February. And I think there are a couple of important things to think about there, because we're sort of at the beginning of this process in many respects. And I don't know this, but my very, very strong instinct and bet is that as a result of what's happening at the moment, there is going to be an extraordinary amount of innovation that takes place outside the immediate future. Basically, and the reason I say that is because nobody is kind of keen for something like this to happen again. And those people who are kind of a bit aged and old like me may remember 9/11 and think about the changes that had in terms of how we travel, to other countries, and what that happened in terms of airports. The sheer amount of innovation that went into processes and technology, etc., etc., etc. That will happen tenfold as a result of this. So it will provoke a lot of innovation, and that will change the things that companies do. It will change what people produce. It will create actually a lot of investment for certain things. So though it kind of seems a bit difficult to see that right now, I would see that, but by the end of this calendar year, and this is my bet, this is my prediction, I don't know this, but you'll see a lot of investment and work going into some of these changes, and that will create opportunities. And I think that the quicker that firms are able to understand what is changing as a result of COVID-19, in what people can drive value from, what people can earn money from, what they need from advisors, being able to get that quickly and aggregate that quickly, I think is a potential source of very strong competitive advantage. By over the course of the rest of this year, that's going to be significant. But we're certainly seeing firms who are now, very simplistically put, if you imagine an interview guide and the questions that are being asked of clients, those things are being recalibrated and being evolved to really have a core component which is around clients' expectations, not just of the now, and of course it's important to understand how it's impacting them now, but as they begin to see some form of new normal emerging, whatever that looks like, what is it going to mean for their aims, their likely business volumes, their expectations, the ways they want to work, what they see as being of value from a professional advisor over the course of the next 12 months, that slightly longer term period. So, how should that firm communicate? And certainly, what we've done, what we're doing over the sort of straddling the year and certainly towards the back end of last year, I was seeing a real increase in the amount of firms that really wanted to understand where market gaps exist, how their firm is positioned, and indeed how they performed relative to competitors. And my sense is none of those things go away, and certainly the need to improve the return from marketing and business development, very, very important in times like these, where I think we can all expect that there will of course be pressure on budgets for the foreseeable future. So this would be, if we were talking 6 months ago, I would be sharing this as an example of a particular firm where across that client base, the feedback over the course of 12 months across a range of clients indicated that for across their portfolio, in just over half, there are opportunities to extend that relationship with clients because of the things that clients saw were important, and because of things on their agenda, because of things that they were aiming to do that the firm wasn't previously aware of. I think that slide will look different now. That slide will look different now, and I suspect that clearly, if we were doing that with the same firm now, the red bar would be higher, the green bar would be lower. So I think a piece of this, and think about, therefore, the questions you ask and the process you ask, which is also uncovering risk as well as opportunity, because clearly holding on to as much of your client base and revenue as you can is going to be fundamentally important now. I'm going to move on, and we'll now begin to talk about some of the important components of successful client research and things to think about. And these are true in principle all the time. The importance of these things doesn't change. the way that you apply them may change a little bit in the current environment. So, as an obvious thing to say, when we're talking about what the right method is of gaining feedback from clients, this is a flippant comment, but of course the amount of appetite and engagement for face-to-face meetings in the short term is not the right approach. So in-depth feedback is relevant, but by virtue of using all the technologies that we've become much more used to using over the last 4 to 6 weeks. But the need to still gain in-depth research from a proportion of your client base that's strategically and financially important to you, still is very significant. But also think about, given the technologies we have and the opportunities we have and the ways of communication which people are doing differently now, that can have an impact in terms of what is the right balance between the feedback that you gain from internal sources through your colleagues and what you choose to gain externally. And this will be different by firm, for your own types of client base, even in terms of the sectors that you operate in. But it may have an impact on the kind of frequency and approach you use to gain feedback. For some people, it might mean that gaining feedback more frequently, but in shorter bursts, as clients' own understanding of how they're impacted, what might change in terms of their aspirations and aims, how they're reacting, what their new strategies might be. As it evolves, that might mean a need to do shorter, more frequent feedback exercise, or gaining dialogue from those individual clients as well. We will talk very much shortly about, irrespective of all those things, it's the more that you can effectively engage with clients and the more that you can effectively engage with colleagues, the better return and the better results you're going to get from any feedback exercise, which is going to profoundly improve the return on investment you get from it. Clearly a key concept to take into account at the moment. But importantly, and again, one of the things that I occasionally see, and it kind of worries me on firms' behalf, is even when there's good feedback gained, a slight inability to actually use it effectively. And again, what we'll talk about a little bit is, if you have this insight, how do you make sure that it impacts what you're able to do with those individual clients that have taken part? How do you make sure it's acted upon? How do you engage people in that? And also, to what degree are you using it to really strengthen the firm? And again, that's really, really important now. So, we will talk about it later, but is this stuff shared with HR? What impact is it having on the support they're giving to your colleagues? What impact is it having on those skills and behaviours that the firm and individuals need to improve? And that's a really key thing at the moment. We were talking to an accountancy network last week, and the core of that was about, what is this going to mean for clients' expectations around how our people communicate, how they link with us, the sort of behaviours they exhibit, and therefore how do we empower and equip our people to perform as strongly as they can on those things which are going to be really important to our client base. Again, I'm conscious of time, so I won't belabor this point in too much detail. But again, if anybody wants to sort of chat about it in more detail later, always very happy to do that. But there is a kind of key piece here in terms of who do you include? And I've mentioned clients, but also your kind of referrers and introducers of work there. And for many firms, it's kind of going to look a little bit like this. If you think about your client portfolio, this isn't a dramatically new thing. You've probably seen a similar thing to this before. But there is a top layer there, which is those clients which you already know are fundamentally, strategically and financially important to you, and you absolutely don't want to lose them, and you absolutely want to understand what's taking place in their world and how you can support them, and you absolutely want to understand what the level of risk is of reduced income from them, but also how you make sure you retain those relationships. Going through to clients that maybe you're unlikely to serve profitably, but that's set within the third row, if you like, there, which may represent a large part or a large volume of your client base. And clearly, it's not sort of economically sensible to use the same process for all of those people. But I'd also make two other observations. I think one of the things which can take place within firms is a kind of over sweating and worrying about this in terms of the engagement with partners, and that kind of sense of, again, if I can say it, and I hope it doesn't offend anybody, the sort of sense of possessiveness which sometimes your colleagues may have over clients taking part in exercises. I think what we're currently facing can be an opportunity to just gently break down some of that possessiveness, because of the recognition of significance and making sure that you're getting feedback and dialogue across the client piece. Also, that third tier there, the real message is use the most sort of economically sensible process to gain feedback across that group of people, and that is likely to be some form of online feedback where you're likely to get a high volume of responses, or from, again, talk about how we encourage and motivate and incentivize people to respond, but where you can get a high number of responses, which clearly is going to increase your visibility of what's important to clients, what you need to perform better at, where there are risks, what numbers of clients there are risks in, what numbers of clients there are opportunities in, what you might need to communicate better, And the more clients that you are able to gain that from, and the more clients that you're able to respond to appropriately, the better. So online feedback is likely to be a significant part of what you do. I'll move on. And again, what we'll talk about a little bit, as I mentioned right at the beginning, a core sort of piece that we started in terms of framing the content for this session a few months ago was, how do we increase response rates? How do we ensure that clients engage with this? How do we make sure it works? And so we'll talk a little bit about that now. Now, at the beginning, and we'll flow through to, why do people engage with you generally? And then we'll talk about, what does that mean in terms of the feedback process and gaining that insight from as many of your client contacts as you can. This is my perspective on it fundamentally. And of course, there's more to it than this. But if we boil it down into three key components, I think these are the three key components from all that we hear from spending almost a lifetime in listening to clients providing feedback about their professional services. So there is, of course, a piece which is about, they are technically really good. Who would choose an advisor that doesn't, for want of a better phrase, know what they're talking about? But of course, what it's really doing is it's getting a firm on that short list as one of the firms for a range of things. And remember that people are using more than one firm across different aspects of advice. It's getting them to be thought of, and for want of a better word, shortlisted for that type of thing. That is what it is doing. It is rarely the thing that drives the choice of firm. Might be some exceptions to the current moment in terms of if there's a real belief that people within firm Y really understand legislation or how to access support. That's potentially one of the aspects that could be true in that area that might drive choice. But I think more of the importance in general terms is in the second and particularly third piece. So, they serve me well, and, we all talk about those aspects of service, which I won't, go through in detail now, but those expectations about communication, how you engage, responsiveness, some of those aspects as well. But I think the third thing, as I talked about, is now and of today more important than it was 3 weeks ago, because people need a friend. And so the ability of the firm to demonstrate that and to ask about what that means for their client base is profoundly important. And I'll be very honest in terms of our use of accountants, what drives the choice that I make for our firm. It is the first thing, but I fundamentally trust that individual, know that person cares about essentially the thriving company and me as an individual. So that is why it's incredibly unlikely I would move to another provider. It's very much around that third one. I think the sense of that has increased over the last 2 months or so. I'm just going to give you a very, very small sort of example. This, and I'm not going to read out all these things, but just to give you a sense that people actually do, your clients do believe that gaining feedback is important. And certainly if there are any firms there who've made that the sort of expectation, if you like, they've created that expectation, tender, or when you've won a new relationship and you've made that commitment to gain feedback. And if you don't actually do that, and I know there are firms that's the case, that then that is noticed, that kind of gap in what you promised to do versus what you are doing, is doesn't go unremarked upon, if you like. But if we're doing this, how do we make sure that clients do get the or how do you make sure that you get a high number of responses so you get the most insight that you possibly can? It's quite, I suppose at one level it's quite simple, isn't it? It's true of all of us. If I'm going to take any time to speak to and have an interview with somebody within the firm or an external party, or if I'm going to complete some form of online or other survey, I am going to be thinking, okay, why should I? How long is it going to take me? Does this stack up for me in terms of what do I get out of this? Is it worth the effort? And again, I think what we're seeing at the moment, and think about this in the context of your own relationships, colleagues and clients, I think that interestingly, there's a bit of a continuum now between people based on their role and what they're doing and their precise area of competence. There are people who are absolutely maxed out in terms of their time commitment at the moment, and the range of responsibilities they have. And actually, at the other end, there are people who are finding they've got more time than they previously had because they're not involved in so many internal meetings, or because that their demands, if you like, from a number of stakeholders have reduced, and actually they possibly have more time, and they are spending some of that time thinking about what is this going to mean for my company, for me, for what we do in the medium and long term. So that for some people there is that increased reflection at the moment, and the two things are important about that. One of which is it is giving them more time to think about this, and potentially they will be more likely to provide feedback to you and to engage with that. But it's also pretty interesting because, of course, they're at that time when they are really thinking about the future and what you hear from them now. And if you're doing that, perhaps in a slightly more frequent way, what you're gaining from them, will enable you to respond and be able to respond to actually what's changing about what your key clients and owners of businesses and those people are making decisions about what firms to use are caring about. So again, potentially this is across that group of people, you have a greater opportunity and the ability to potentially build competitive advantage. But if one of the things I'd absolutely take from today is that piece. Think about that from your client's perspective. In any exercise where they're providing feedback, what are they going to get? Is it worth the time they spent to it? And communicate that effectively to them. I'm going to be a bit unfair now because I did happen to pick up an example which is just this, and I won't show it for a long time, but I just take a brief look at that kind of second sentence in there, and the message which is really coming across there is, help us. So we're doing this survey, and can you help us? That's not the message that we should be giving. In any of your communication with people that you want to provide feedback, as soon as you say, well, this is in our interests, and don't give them a sense of why it's going to benefit them, then that's going to impact your response rate. And it's an easy trap to fall into, isn't it? But I still see a number of examples of where the communication on surveys is essentially that. It's about, we really want to find out some information, so please help us, which is all well and good, but you're missing the amount of people who potentially could provide you with insight that's really going to improve your financial and strategic importance, because you're not saying, actually, there's a benefit to you in doing this. So think about that in 3 different stages, and we'll go through it. There's a piece which is about how they feel about you and what you've communicated to them before you actually send the request, whether it's to take part in an interview, whether it's to meet with somebody, or whether it's to provide online feedback. How you're setting that up for success before you send that invitation, what you're saying in that invitation, how the client is going to receive it, and while they're actually participating in that. So whether they're doing an online form, or if they're engaged with somebody in some form of interview, what's their experience like at each stage of that process? So I'm not going to belabor all these points given time, and of course you will get the PDF of all the slides later, but those sorts of things. So, again, think about it from the cost benefit of your client. What's the purpose of doing this? What am I going to get as a result? And if I do this, and this is a really important bit, this 4th bullet in this thing, if I do this, is it kind of just going to go within somewhere general? Do I think that there'll be a response? Has my contact given me a sense that they'll take this seriously and they're really interested in it? And will something happen as a result? Conversely put, if they're asking me to provide feedback 6 times a year, I'm going to get a bit fed up with that. And particularly if they're asking me what seems to be the same thing 6 times a year, I'm going to get very fed up with that. So what's the point of this request? What's the value that I'll get from this question that I answer, or this feedback I provide? And in the process of being interviewed, is it actually an enjoyable process for them? Is it an engaging thing? Are the questions asked engaging? Are they fundamentally important to them? Are they based on that client's agenda? And a similar sort of thing really in if you're doing online feedback, it feels really kind of mechanical, or it feels like it's driven very much by the firm wanting to just try and earn more money from me. Is it a bit tiresome? Then I'm going to drop out of that, or I might not drop out of it, but there's an increasing chance that I will. And also that last one, it sounds a bit of a sort of mechanical point, but if you're doing online surveys, make sure that if the person does get interrupted, and let's face it, sometimes they will, there's an obvious and transparent process for them to be able to come back and finish what they started. Because if they've kind of done it halfway through and they can't do that, you've got issues in terms of your data, but their likelihood to start again. Again, with this piece about making sure you get the greatest level of response possible, I've seen some examples, and this is kind of just giving a sense of this. And this was a really, really well-intentioned thing, I think, whereby clearly what the firm was trying to do was understand what different types of ways they could package their advice solutions, what packages would seem to have the most value, and they were also trying to get a sense of the pricing for those things, all of which is profoundly sensible and profoundly reasonable, and understand why. But the person taking that survey was faced with screens and screens like this, which were clearly trying to drill down into, okay, how should we rank the ways that we package our solutions and charge for them? But it really just became, as somebody taking it, really, really cumbersome and tiresome, and for want of a better word, boring, because you're trying to think about, well, hang on a minute, what's the context of this A and B and C and D, and how do I do that? I can't remember what A was. So you need to make it relatively easy, and I think that the concept behind that research was sound, but they won't have got many responses just because it was too hard and too complicated for somebody to really think through and to respond to. So, putting that all together in terms of some of the things to think about to get a higher response rate from the people that you really want to be giving you an understanding of what they're facing, what they want to do, what they believe they'll do over the next 12 months, what they need help on, what drives their choice, why they will choose firm A rather than firm B, etc., 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 how they want you to communicate, all those good things. Try and do as many of those things on the left-hand side as you can. Make sure you don't do those things on the right-hand side. And just briefly to pick up a couple of those, as we talked about before, and why should I do this? An indication of the firm taking it seriously, and a kind of indication that you care, and an indication of your interest with it, is to make sure it comes from somebody that they know and somebody senior, rather than a other, which they may not even read the invitation if you do that. And give them a sense of, well, what is the cost to me? How long is this going to take? Say, this is how we're using these things. This is what we intend to do. This is how it will impact the service we provide to you, and this is why we're asking. And on the right-hand side, make sure that the questions are clear. I think it's much rarer now to see a survey whereby it's difficult to complete on a phone rather than a laptop, but they still exist. So make sure that you think about how the sheer process of taking part works for a provider, and test it out. Do those things. And again, might sound a really kind of sort of boring or mechanical thing to say, but I occasionally still see ones that include typos and things like that. And the reason I mention that is, it may not seem as though it's important, and I know that sometimes people are very keen to get things out and to rush things, but kind of the negative side of that is some people see the kind of quality of writing and lack of typos as a proxy for the competence of the firm. So if they're seeing that, then there is an impact on perceptions of you. And of course, what you're aiming to do here is improve perceptions of the firm, not potentially risk. Probably self-evident, but I'll say it. Anything whereby you're having dialogue, if we're doing it through some form of interview, should be something which the client finds engaging, interesting, on subjects that they care about and important to them, and is not just, I am going to read out 5 things, please tell me what is important to you, and rank them in order, because that's boring and people don't want to do it, and the level of interest you'll get back from it, the level of quality of the feedback you get ain't going to be great. So again, really make this stuff as engaging as you can, whoever is doing it, external party, yourselves, and that's true of any sort of form of dialogue. So I hope that's been helpful in terms of some of the things to think about in terms of the value of the insights you get, the content you get, the number of people that participate, and some of those things. I'm just going to finish briefly on 2 additional areas, which are essentially making sure you're able to use that information and the insight you get, and making sure that the firm gets the benefit from it, making sure that clients get the benefit from it, making sure that your marketing and business development efforts get the benefit from it, and also some thoughts about engaging your colleagues as well, because of course you want them to buy in to the process, but also the results, so that they will act, behave, and change should they need to, and indeed take the opportunities where there are opportunities to extend relationships or need to make activity to retain those. So this is just to give you a sense of it, a couple of examples. We happen to have a diagnostic, but really the more important thing about this is think about some of the ways in which you could use it. So where you're getting insight, to what degree is this being used in what the practice head talks about in their meetings? Is that on the agenda? Is it expected to be something that they talk about? It's expected to be something that they'll act and make decisions on. Are you both asking the right questions and using it in the decision-making process of the firm to say, okay, which are the priority areas for action? Which of these do we need to act upon on a firm-wide basis? Which of these are around practices? Which of these are really only about specific clients? And particularly, and I think increasingly important in the future, significant investment decisions. And certainly a couple of projects we've done recently in terms of how firms use technology, or as I've mentioned before, they kind of how they position themselves, or their use of processes. What are the ways that clients would most value? Making sure they understand that and don't make assumptions that could prove to be incorrect before they invest money. That's quite important too. So those are just some examples of those at the kind of decision-making level. At a more, if you will, kind of ongoing day-to-day communication tactical level, some of these things as well. Are you making sure that you're reusing? If you find out about what areas of content are particularly important, what things people are thinking about doing, what's on their time horizon for the next 12 months, if more people are thinking about restructuring than acquiring, how are you using that and what you talk about, blog about, the content on your websites, etc., etc., etc. Are you thinking about the opportunities for thought leadership in terms of what's coming now and the innovation that may happen? Are you ensuring that you both get and utilize some of the great feedback you get for pitch documents and the like in testimonials and some of those things? And indeed, think about, what might be stopping you exploiting the value you're getting from client insights. That's really a snapshot of a longer diagnostic. And if anybody did want to take a look at the whole thing and use the whole thing to improve what they gain, just let me know. Very happy to you have that. Just very finally, final few moments. This, of course, is important and very, very flippantly put. Imagine you got some really fantastic insight across your clients that really meant you should do certain things and you could improve the strength of the firm, make its long-term health much more sustainable, make your pipeline better, reduce the risk, all those things. If the insight profoundly allowed you to do that, but your people kind of weren't bought in or dismissed it or didn't believe what they were hearing from clients, then you're not going to get the benefits. So these are just some final thoughts about what can be in the mind of your colleagues. And, as I talked about before, it's probably unlikely that any of you are coming from firms whereby either everybody's utterly resistant to this and never wants any of their clients to provide feedback at all, or indeed firms whereby everybody thinks this is the most important thing that should happen in the next 5 minutes. There'll be a range of continuum from all those things, and some of the things that put people on a part of that continuum are included here. So the resistance and the people that you may find are impacting your ability to gain as many responses or really push feedback as much as you might like to. They may be feeling or asking themselves one of those questions on the left-hand side. So to what degree can you give them comfort about those things? Because you should be able to. And when we talked about, we engage very much in the feelers in terms of that process, their ability to pre-brief, their ability to potentially add questions that are relevant to them, their ability to access us so that they feel comfortable with the process, and their ability to understand what happens next, their ability to input in terms of, well, these are the things that we're really facing as a practice, so therefore these will be the things that will be really useful to gain a sense of, some of that stuff. And on the right-hand side, make sure you're communicating the potential use of client feedback from your clients to enable you to do those things. Because it's a little bit like what we were talking about earlier with the clients. What do I get out of this? Why is it worth taking the time? That's the same for your colleagues as well. Certainly for those people who are perhaps, and I'm certainly thinking through one of them, actually using this unusual time to think about how it uses client feedback in performance management and what it means in terms of how the performance of fee earners evolves and changes to be a bit broad and reflect some of those things. If somebody believes that they will be more able to hit their performance targets and be able to demonstrate, that they are, for want of a better word, a star and performing highly as a result of this, then that can be, of course, hugely beneficial. So this is just an example of, again, I would absolutely say to people that anytime you're getting feedback from a client, the next step should be, what do we do as a result? And So, for example, what we do when we're getting feedback from clients of our clients is we just put we don't say you should do this or you must do this, but these are tentative sort of or things that we would suggest are certainly worth thinking about. And then that just helps reduce time from, oh crikey, what do we do, to a sense of, okay, these are some things that we can act upon, and this is the sort of accountability and time frame for each of these. So this is just an excerpt from that. There's a kind of who should do it, what time, how do we follow up, etc. piece to each of those. And I'll just finally mention at the end, we've been talking quite a bit about how do you make sure you get the number of responses you really want to, how do you make sure that it's a good exercise for the firm, how do you make sure it's perceived positively by your clients. But as I say, do think about how you use this stuff, particularly in the current environment. So I think I've mentioned that I think there's going to be a change in how clients want firms to behave, communicate, interact, advise, be that trusted advisor, and that will impact their choice of firm to use. So if you gain that, make sure that you're not just keeping that yourselves, but potentially are you sharing that with your HR colleagues? Because, the firms have a choice about, well, shall we just invest in whatever training we invest in the future based on guesses, assumptions, what might be important, or will we invest in those things which, because we know they're going to have a profound impact on what clients value and how they choose between firms, and potentially those ones where we may not be performing to their expectations, or we may not be performing as well as competitors, or if we did perform better, we'd get a definite competitive advantage. Why not include those things in training? Because that enables both marketing and HR to demonstrate a potential real return on investment there. And you can see those other examples on that slide. You should be able to use it to win more work, as we talked about. Over the short term, that may be to retain more work, but to really understand what specialisms and capabilities are required. Now, I think we're pretty much at the kind of 50-minute mark, that's probably enough for me burbling on for the time being. But of course, I think we may have a few questions. I think, Louise, are you able to give a sense of the questions we have? I'll just mention very briefly before we do that, if there's stuff that I haven't covered that you want to ask about, or you've got any queries that aren't covered in the next few minutes by the process, just give me a shout. You will get those slides, and indeed, if you want a link to that free diagnostic, do take it.
Okay, thanks very much, Robin. I thought that was really, really interesting. We have had a few questions. If anyone else wants to ask any more questions, then you can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Unsurprisingly, probably, a number of the questions are focused on partners, engaging. How do we get them to commit? A lot of us are experiencing budget cuts at the moment. So how would you basically on engaging partners? And someone has said specifically, they're constantly having their partners won't budge, and if they don't engage, it doesn't happen. Is there any along these lines?
Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts on that, and hopefully maybe one of those later slides may have helped too. I think that it will be different for different partners, I think is also worth saying, but there certainly is something about at the firm level having a very clear story about, particularly in this current time, and I think there is potentially a stronger story to say at this current time, have a very clear piece about what will this do financially. That links into making sure that your questions are uncovering in a way which works for the client, what their futures hold, what issues are important to them, and hence, you shouldn't ask, do you want tax advice? But questions which will enable you to see things which are both most significant for the firm as a whole, but provide opportunity and leads to individual parts of the practices and, you know, some of those recalcitrant partners and fee earners as well. So that's part of the answer. Part of the answer, as I think you mentioned, is that think about those areas of resistance, which can be fear, discomfort, and giving them comfort around some of those areas, which might involve you in using, you know, your third parties. And I say quite a bit of the effort we take when we're starting a program is engagement with people who are worried. You know, that they are worried, and they may not express it in that way, but they're concerned about, well, what might the client say? What if it doesn't make me look good? Is it going to take me a huge amount of time? So giving them comfort around those. The good news, I would say, is I would say that some of the strongest advocates that we have of client feedback within our client firms have actually started from that position. You know, they've started from that position, but going through a small exercise sometimes with some of those, and I guess that's another part of it, not just saying, right, well, tough, we're going to interview 30 of your clients, etc., but giving them a route to doing this on a relatively low risk basis can also be helpful. And it's absolutely true that some of those people who were most worried or were demonstrating that resistance at the beginning have become real advocates of client feedback within their firms, because suddenly, as soon as they get the first few and they realize what it can provide, and their concerns are lessened, that really does change the way they see things. I hope that's answered at least the meat of that question.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, someone's asked, and I don't know if you'll be able to generalize this way, but what are the top 3 things that partners find the most interesting from feedback responses? So it's part of that engagement, how, you know, keeping the partners engaged question, but you know, are there themes around that? Are there top things that they want to know, and against anything else?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Some of this is dependent on the context. So, you know, if you are, let's say, a practice leader versus an X versus a Y versus a Z, that will influence what you would find most interesting and most helpful. Or I guess, too generalised to use your phrase, 2 or 3 things. I think, and it might sound a bit mechanical, but it's still important. The thing which is giving them insight in terms of what we should do with this client, or actually I'll phrase that slightly differently, ideas about what they should consider doing with that client, i.e. that individual client feedback, which means X. These are the things that are important. This is how we can improve that relationship, strengthen that relationship, deal with an issue, etc., etc. That's certainly one. What I would really encourage people to do, almost at the absolute opposite end, is engage very much within your firms. And, you know, strategy making is an interesting term at the moment, isn't it? Because people are kind of, that whole process of doing that is evolving. But the more closely you are linked into something which is about the firm's strategic objective and something that people feel is fundamental to the future of the firm, that's going to gain traction. So I think I mentioned a couple of examples in the previous things. So where there's concern about how are we performing against competitors, or we seem not to be winning as much work as others, or we seem to be weaker in this area, or we don't know if we should invest in X. And I think we talked about earlier about really understanding, well, what investment decisions should we make at the moment? So tie it into those decision-making processes, if you like, in terms of strategically, what are the options we should make? And I mean that in terms of the questions, but also the process by which your firm and colleagues are making strategy as well. And I guess the third thing, again, it might sound a little bit simplistic, is the more that you are through the questions, the process, and how you're packaging the results, answering the question, what is going to drive the choice of us versus other firms, or our ability to retain clients, or our ability to extend what we do for the firm, for my practice, and for me, then again, that's all typically helpful.
Okay, great. We've got 2 more questions. We can maybe try and just cover them quickly. One of them is, again, it probably leads into this. So someone's saying the partners at their firm are very engaged, but how would you suggest that they know that the partners and client team are actually doing the actions that come from the feedback? So they're engaged in the feedback happening, but how do we know that they're doing the follow-up?
I think, yeah, we were talking about making sure the actions are actually undertaken. So one thing is, if you're getting engaged in those practice and team meetings and things like that, in the right method for your firm and culture and the team leader and all those things, getting that as an agenda item, what happened, things we were doing, or the feedback we heard in X. That's one process that I see happening quite a lot. The other one is a range of things which are fundamentally about having it as an expected part of the process of follow-up to feedback. So whether you're using, if you have systems whereby you're logging information and your inverted commas CRM systems, and there's a process to do that, or you can relatively easily adopt a process to do that. That's one approach. Versus also, I guess what I see happen quite a lot is where the relevant marketing or BD person with the responsibility just is, having that as a task to catch up, and it's an accepted thing that they do every month with the relevant fee earners and people. So it sounds a bit mechanical, but doing that, I'll just add one more piece to that. I think if we're talking there about kind of what you do at the end of the process, it's worth not just thinking about that at the end of the process and when you've received the feedback. So for example, if you're starting in a new feedback program, as part of that engagement with partners and clients, talk about the overall results and benefits and how we should secure them. So their expectations are set that that's a good thing to do.
Great. And just final question, somebody's saying, as part of our feedback program, is to measure their performance. This means most questions have to be the same or similar. How would you advise keeping a client interested whilst asking the same question, essentially?
Yeah, I guess, could you put that back up, Louise? Because I guess I'm just wanting to understand a little bit more about what that what that's driven to. I think
so
if you
most questions have to be the same or similar as the feedback is to measure performance. So how do you keep a client interested while asking the same question?
Okay. I think there's a couple of possible things within that. I mean, if we're talking about the ability to have robust measures that are quantitative, reliable, and people would accept, then a piece of that is around just making sure you're gaining that from a wide and a big number of clients, rather than necessarily having to answer the same client, the same question. I think, and this is a real rule of thumb, I think if you're asking for essentially tell us quantitatively how we're performing as part of that, two things, one of which is in general terms, this is a real rule of thumb, but you're okay to ask that sort of once a year, I think, without getting too much boredom, if you like, from the client's perspective. But if you're looking for that on a kind of matter specific basis, and your relationship and volume of work with the client does suggest that's worthwhile, and you might do a few things. You might just ask about which three things were particularly important in this instance and get just feedback on that. That's one answer. I think it depends a little bit more on the context, to be honest. So I've kind of half answered that, and if the person asking that would kind of like to ask that in more depth, and they're very happy to do so. But that's a kind of at least some of the clues about dealing with that.
Okay, I think that's us then. Thanks again. I think that was a really interesting session. Thanks to everyone who joined us. There are a number of events coming up. We've got one on Thursday, so if you keep an eye on the PM Forum website, then you can register for any of our future events. Okay, thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening. I hope that was helpful.